We've always believed the greyhound was a modern creation, refined by selective breeding. But ancient DNA just revealed the truth, and it changes everything. For centuries, we looked at Egyptian tomb art and assumed it was just a starting point. It wasn't. New genetic evidence proves the greyhound's origin was never what we thought. It's thousands of years older and far more complex than any kennel registry could tell us. Today we're breaking down the data that finally breaks the myth. That first clue is unsettling because it forces a harder question. If the greyhound already existed in the visual language of ancient Egypt, how much of what we think we know about its origin is only a later simplification? A dog can resemble another dog. A painting can preserve a shape. But resemblance is not the same as proof of ancestry. For centuries, people looked at the greyhound and saw a clean, elegant line. A hunting dog made for speed, apparently obvious, apparently self-explaining. Yet the oldest evidence suggests something stranger. The animal was not simply invented by one culture at one moment. It was already moving through human history with a depth that paintings alone could not fully explain, and that is where the real mystery begins. The Egyptian tomb scenes are not just decorative echoes. They are a fixed point in time, a public mark that dogs like this mattered enough to be remembered in the afterlife. They tell us that the greyhound's form was admired so early that it became part of a civilization's visual record. But they do not tell us where that form came from, how it traveled, or whether the dog in those tombs was the ancestor of today's greyhounds, or simply one branch of a much wider, older family. The more you stare at that gap, the larger it becomes. History gave us the silhouette. What it did not give us was the full lineage, and that missing line is exactly where ancient DNA changes everything. Because once genetics enters the story, the dog in the tomb stops being just an image and becomes a clue that points beyond Egypt, beyond later breeding traditions, and beyond the neat stories people like to tell about noble hunting dogs born already perfect. The greyhound's body still carries the force of that old puzzle, a chest built for breath, a spine that seems engineered for acceleration, a head drawn into a narrow blade of motion. For a long time, those traits encouraged a simple story. People assumed the breed was ancient in appearance, but modern in origin, refined by recent breeders, yet somehow timeless in look. Ancient Egyptian tomb art complicates that immediately. It shows that the dog's deep past was not a rumor. It was visible. So the question is no longer whether the greyhound is old. It clearly is. The real question is why its origin story was ever allowed to stay so incomplete for so long, and what ancient DNA is about to reveal once that silence is broken. Then a different clue appears, and it is not carved in stone. It is hidden in a word. The name itself carries movement. In the account preserved by Une Histoire de Galgos, the word galgo is traced back to the Latin gallicus, meaning dog of Gaul. That single root changes the direction of the search. It suggests that the story of this animal was never locked inside one kingdom, one court, or one visual tradition. It moved. It crossed languages. It crossed borders. And in that crossing, it picked up a history that written portraits alone could never fully explain. If the body hinted at speed, the name hints at passage. Gallicus points toward Gaul, toward the Celtic peoples who settled in the western part of the Iberian Peninsula, and toward a corridor of exchange where dogs, customs, and hunting methods could travel together. That matters, because it means the greyhound type was not simply admired from afar and later copied. It may have been carried, traded, adapted, and reinterpreted by communities that valued the same sharp instinct. See first, run first, catch fast. Now the question deepens. If the term that survives in Spanish already remembers Gaul, then the breed's past cannot be read only through Egyptian art or later aristocratic kennels. There is a linguistic footprint here, one that points to a Western route of circulation and a much more layered ancestry. The dog's identity was being shaped not just by selective breeding, but by contact between peoples who recognized usefulness in the same lean body and relentless pursuit. And that is where the old certainty starts to crack. Because once language enters the evidence, the map becomes wider than the image. The greyhound was not only an elegant runner preserved by taste, it was also a traveler of names, a witness to migration, and possibly a companion to the movements of Celtic groups into Iberia, where the word Gallicus left a mark that still survives in Galgo today. That detail may seem small, almost accidental, but it forces a larger rethinking. A breed name can preserve memory when records fail. It can carry traces of contact, conquest, adaptation, and survival. In this case, it suggests that the line leading to the modern greyhound was already weaving through different cultures long before modern breeders began to standardize appearance. The animal's story was never just biological, it was linguistic, geographic, and human. So the investigation shifts. We are no longer asking only where the dog looked ancient. We are asking where its name wandered, who spoke it, and what kind of world had to exist for a hunting dog to become so deeply tied to both language and landscape. Because if Gallicus survived inside Galgo, then the breed's past is not merely old. It is mobile. It is borrowed. It is the kind of history that leaves behind a word before it leaves behind a pedigree. And once you see that, the next question is unavoidable. If the name remembers a route into Iberia, what else about the greyhound's origin has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for archaeology and genetics to catch up with a clue that language preserved all along? By the time the Roman world reached deep into Iberia, the dog was already doing real work there, not as a symbol, not as a decorative court animal, but as a hare hunter built for speed, discipline, and the brutal logic of open ground. The Galgo Español belongs to that older practical world. Fun Factorium describes it as a lineage breed used in the Iberian Peninsula for hunting hares since at least the Roman era, and that detail changes the tone of the entire investigation. It means we are not dealing with a modern invention that later borrowed an ancient look. We are looking at a working animal whose function had already been fixed by the demands of the landscape centuries ago. That matters because function leaves a different kind of evidence than fashion. A dog bred to chase a hare across dry fields, scrubland, and long sightlines cannot be understood only through portraits or polished kennel descriptions. Its body had to answer to something harsher. Longer legs were not an aesthetic flourish. A narrow chest was not a coincidence. The lean frame, deep lung capacity, and explosive first burst all make sense only when you imagine the animal running for its life, and the quarry reading every movement a fraction of a second too late. In Iberia, that balance between predator, prey, and terrain created a selection pressure that shaped the breed from the ground up. And once that practical role is clear, a new tension enters the story. Because if the Galgo Español was already established as a hare hunter in Roman times, then its history cannot be reduced to recent breeding fashions or to a simple imported stereotype of elegance. The breed had a job before it had a modern image. It belonged to fields before it belonged to registries. That distinction is crucial. A lineage can survive for centuries not because people admire it, but because it repeatedly proves useful in the same demanding task. The Iberian setting also adds another layer. This was not an isolated island of selection. It was a crossroads of movement, trade, and war, where dogs could travel with soldiers, hunters, merchants, and settlers, then adapt to local needs. In that environment, the greyhound type did not need to emerge once and stay fixed. It could be reinforced, crossed, sharpened, and preserved by people who valued speed above ornament. So the question becomes more precise. If Roman-era Iberia already held a dog like this, how much of the modern greyhound is actually modern at all? That question is where archaeology and genetics begin to press against older assumptions. A breed that performs with such consistency usually carries a much deeper past than its paper trail suggests. Bones, proportions, and hunting habits point to continuity, but DNA can reveal whether that continuity was local, imported, blended, or repeatedly reshaped by human choice. And in the case of the Galgo Español, the answer is more intricate than a single origin story. The dog's place in Iberia was not just as a visitor passing through, it was there as a tool, a partner, and a specialist refined by use. Seen that way, the Roman reference is not a footnote. It is a warning against simplifying the breed into a recent elegance with old styling. It tells us that the history preserved in the field is older than the history preserved in the kennel. It tells us that the chase came first, and only later did people begin to define the animal with formal names, standards, and lineage charts. Before the pedigree became a document, it was already a pattern of survival repeated across dust, distance, and speed. And that leaves the story poised on a sharper edge. If Iberia was not the beginning, but one decisive chapter in a far longer chain, then the next layer has to explain how this hunting specialist moved through broader human worlds without losing its essential shape. The question is no longer only how old the Galgo Español is. It is how an animal so tightly tied to one task could remain recognizable across centuries, empires, and changing ideas of what a dog should be. And here the trail does something unexpected. It stops being only archaeological and becomes official. According to Fun Factorium's public profile on the Galgo Español, the Fédération Cynologique Internationale recognizes it under number 285, not as a vague type, not as a decorative label, as a formal breed placed in Group 10, Section 3, the short-haired sighthounds, with Spain listed as the patron country. That detail matters because it pulls the dog out of the haze of assumption and places it inside a modern system of classification that exists to separate impression from identity. For a long time, people spoke about this dog as if its essence could be reduced to shape alone. The narrow frame, the deep chest, the long legs, the clean line from shoulder to hock. But the FCI entry says something sharper. It says that the breed is not just admired, it is recognized, catalogued, defined, given a position in a living international order that is meant to preserve what centuries of use and selection have made distinct. That recognition does not erase the older layers. It confirms them. It tells us that the body built for pursuit, for vision, for acceleration over open ground, did not remain an informal local memory. It survived long enough to be fixed into a global standard. And once that happens, the question changes again. We are no longer asking whether this lineage existed. We are asking how an ancient working form managed to arrive in the present with enough coherence to be officially named by one of the most respected canine authorities in the world. The answer is not simple inheritance. It is continuity under pressure. Generations of hunters needed a dog that could read distance instantly, launch without hesitation, and keep the chase honest across terrain where speed alone was never enough. That demand shaped more than appearance. It shaped temperament, movement, balance, and the spare economy of every line in the body. What ancient DNA begins to expose is that this was not an accidental resemblance between old images and modern dogs. It was a long preservation of function, carried through many human hands before any registry ever tried to summarize it. So the FCI classification becomes more than a bureaucratic milestone. It is a bridge between two worlds that once seemed disconnected. The deep past recovered from bones and samples, and the present-day breed standard that insists on consistency, pedigree, and formal recognition. In that bridge, the dog's history grows clearer, but also more surprising, because official status does not mean the puzzle is over. It means the puzzle has been assembled just enough to reveal a larger pattern beneath it, and that larger pattern is what makes this moment feel so charged. A dog shaped by ancient pursuit is now anchored in a modern international framework, yet its origin still reaches beyond the neat borders that people like to draw around breeds. The classification confirms the lineage without flattening it. It gives the past a badge, but not a conclusion. If anything, it forces a harder thought. How many other animals carry a story that is older, deeper, and more complex than the names we eventually gave them? The Galgo Español stands there as proof that official recognition can arrive late, after centuries of use, while the real history has been running beside humans all along, silent, swift, and impossible to reduce to a single origin line. Then the evidence stopped behaving like a straight line. When researchers at PMC examined genomic data from 123 hairs, drawn from African, European, Russian, and Middle Eastern lineages, the neat old expectation began to break apart. The result was not a single ancestral corridor leading cleanly toward one modern form. It was a web. Multiple origins, broad mixing, and repeated contact between lineages turned what had sounded simple into something far more unstable and revealing. That matters here, because it changes the way a swift hunting dog can be understood. If the prey populations themselves carry a history of movement, blending, and regional divergence, then the dog built to pursue them was never evolving in a sealed world. It was reacting to a landscape where biology and geography were already in motion. This is the point where the older picture starts losing its authority. For a long time, it was tempting to imagine one elegant source, one ancient template, one clear route from antiquity to the modern racing form. But the genetic record does not reward that kind of simplicity. It shows that the past was messy in a precise way, not random, not vague, but layered with encounters that left marks on survival, speed, and the way humans chose what to keep. The long, narrow outline we now associate with pursuit was not handed down intact from a single origin. It was assembled through pressure, selection, and repeated refinement across different human and ecological settings. And that shift is bigger than a correction in taxonomy. It changes the emotional weight of the whole investigation. Because once the old model fails, the dog is no longer just a symbol of elegance or speed. It becomes the visible result of many hidden crossings. The body carries decisions made in kennels, markets, hunting grounds, and breeding lines that were never as isolated as later stories pretended. Ancient DNA does not merely confirm a rumor from the past. It exposes how often the past was already mixing its own versions of reality before anyone wrote them down. That is why the modern silhouette feels different after the genetics. The line from head to flank, the explosive chase, the lean efficiency of the frame. None of it now reads like a miracle of singular descent. It reads like inheritance under pressure, a form shaped by repeated demands, preserved because it worked, and stabilized because people noticed the result and wanted it again. The revelation is not that the hunting dog became fast. It is that speed was never the property of one origin at all. It was the outcome of many histories meeting the same practical need. And that leads to a harder, richer question. If multiple hare populations were already telling a story of movement and mixture, what else in the record has been flattened by the desire for a clean beginning? The more the genome clarifies, the less room there is for old certainties that depended on appearance alone. A painting can suggest continuity, a skeleton can suggest form. But DNA can reveal how that form was assembled from fragments of a much wider world. So the real surprise is not simply that the old model was incomplete. It is that the incompleteness was hiding in plain sight, inside the very traits people admired most. The speed was real. The body was real. The chase was real. But their origin was never singular, and their meaning is deeper now because of it. What looked like a polished lineage turns out to be a record of crossings, selections, and recoveries that stretched across regions and generations. If this changes how you see the greyhound, it should. Share this with someone who still thinks breed history begins and ends with appearance, because the genome has already shown how much that view misses. And when you look again at the animal in full stride, it is no longer just chasing a quarry. It is carrying a hidden archive of movement, one that joins distant lands to a single living form. On the Iberian Peninsula, the greyhound's story stops looking like a neat invention and starts looking like a long inheritance. The galgo español was already there in Roman times, running after hares with the kind of precision that only comes from generations of selection. Fun Factorium notes that this breed has been used for hare hunting in Spain since at least the Roman era. And that detail matters because it places the dog inside a living landscape of work, not inside a museum of appearances. That is where the old interpretation begins to wobble. For years, the elegant outline of the greyhound invited a simple answer. One ancient line, carried forward almost untouched, polished by human preference into the sleek runner we recognize today. But the deeper record refuses that comfort. The Roman field, the Iberian hunt, the endurance required to track a hare over open ground, all of it shows continuity. Yet continuity is not the same as purity. A tradition can survive for centuries and still be assembled from many crossings, many local choices, many hidden exchanges between populations that left no obvious trace in the shape of a skull or the curve of a back. That is why ancient DNA changes the story so dramatically. It does not erase the Roman image of the greyhound. It repositions it. The dog still belonged to the chase, still depended on speed, still carried a body built for pursuit. But the genome makes clear that those qualities were not preserved by a single straight line of descent. They were refined through movement, contact, and selective pressure across time. What looked stable from the outside was, beneath the surface, a history of repeated recalibration, and that is the unsettling beauty of the revelation. Once the biological record is allowed to speak, the greyhound is no longer just a symbol of elegance and velocity. It becomes evidence that human culture can preserve a function while the ancestry behind that function shifts in ways no painted scene could fully capture. A dog can remain recognizable for 2,000 years and still carry an older, messier, more interesting origin than anyone expected. So the question is no longer whether the galgo is ancient. It is. The real question is how many ancient paths converged to make that Roman hunter possible. and how much of what we thought we knew was only the visible edge of a much broader canine history. If that hidden complexity surprises you, it should. Share it with someone who still thinks a breed's story begins with its outline, because the outline was never the whole truth. The genome has simply pushed the door wider, and what is waiting behind it is a lineage far richer than the old narrative allowed. A white dog lunges forward across the field, and for a moment it seems as if the answer should be simple. A greyhound is a greyhound. Clean lines, narrow chest, long stride, purpose made visible in motion. But the more closely the record is examined, the less simple that certainty becomes, because even the official identity of the galgo points to a history that is both ancient and carefully organized by modern institutions. According to Funfactorium's public profile on the Galgo Español, the breed is recognized by the Fédération Cynologique Internationale under standard number 285. It sits in Group 10, Section 3, the short-haired sighthounds, with Spain listed as the patron country. That classification matters because it is not just a label. It is a formal statement that a living breed has been measured, named, and placed inside a global system of canine identity. Yet that system only captures the visible surface. It tells you where the breed stands now, not how many earlier paths had to converge to produce it. That is where the ancient DNA becomes decisive. Once the genetic evidence is brought into view, the galgo stops looking like the product of a single clean origin and starts looking like the endpoint of repeated historical crossings, regional pressures, and human choices that favored speed, balance, and pursuit over centuries. The modern standard preserves the silhouette, but the biological story behind it reaches farther back and spreads wider than the official frame suggests. This is the real correction the research delivers. Not that the galgo was invented late, and not that its identity is uncertain, but that certainty itself had been too narrow. A breed can be formally recognized in the present, and still carry ancestry shaped by older populations, older routes of movement, and older forms of selection that no kennel registry could fully describe. The body was refined for function, but the lineage was assembled through history. So the Galgo Españols ends up standing in two registries at once. One is written in the language of breed standards, with Standard 285, Group 10, Section 3, and Spain as the patron country. The other is written in fragments of bone, old genomes, and the stubborn evidence of continuity mixed with change. Put together, they show why this dog has always seemed so exact in outline, and yet so difficult to reduce to a simple origin story. That is why the revelation matters beyond one breed. It shows how ancient DNA can return depth to a history flattened by appearance alone. It can tell us that what looks complete may actually be only the last visible layer of a much older inheritance. And once that becomes clear, the galgo is no longer just a symbol of elegance or speed. It becomes a reminder that identity can be officially recognized, scientifically revised, and still remain older, stranger, and richer than the name attached to it. By the time the evidence settles into place, the old image of the greyhound begins to lose its simplicity. This was never just a sleek dog that arrived fully formed in the modern world. It was already running through the Iberian Peninsula long before today's breed clubs, long before polished standards, long before anyone tried to compress its story into a neat origin line. The Galgo Español is a hare-hunting breed of ancient lineage, and on the Iberian Peninsula, it was used for hare hunting from at least the Roman era, a detail that matters because it pushes the story backward into a world where function, survival, and human need shaped every generation. That Roman anchor changes the mood of the entire investigation. A dog that seems so refined in silhouette turns out to have stood inside a much older rhythm of field work and pursuit. The body was never only admired, it was asked to perform. Speed had to be real, not imagined. Endurance had to be earned, not assumed. And once ancient DNA enters the picture, the lineage stops looking like a straight path and starts looking like a long conversation between movement, selection, and survival across time. What makes that revelation so powerful is not just that the breed is old, it is that the old story was incomplete in a very specific way. People could see the outline, they could read the hunt in the posture, the lean frame, the stretched musculature, the eyes tuned to motion. They could trace its presence through paintings, documents, and regional memory. But appearance can only carry history so far. The bone record and the genomes preserved in ancient remains add a second layer, one that does not flatter the myth but deepens the truth. They show that the galgo's identity was assembled through more than one route, more than one population, and more than one historical moment. So the final picture is not a simple correction. It is a rescue of depth. The dog we know today is the visible outcome of centuries of human choice and natural pressure working together. Its shape is not accidental, but neither is it the product of a single origin. It carries the mark of older roots, older uses, and older lives. That is why the discovery feels larger than one breed. It reminds us that domesticated animals often preserve histories our eyes cannot fully read, histories that only become visible when ancient DNA is allowed to speak. And once it speaks, the greyhound is no longer just a symbol of speed or elegance. It becomes proof that memory can live inside flesh, that a working animal can outlast the stories told about it, and that scientific evidence can return dignity to what history had simplified. The Galgo Español stands there with a quieter kind of power now, not as a finished legend, but as a living archive of Iberian fields, Roman continuity, and a genetic past that was always older than the name given to it. That is the truth. Ancient DNA finally brought into focus. The breed was never a single clean line, but a layered inheritance shaped across centuries. Its grace is real, its purpose is real, its antiquity is real. And the deeper we look, the more we understand that the most familiar forms in the animal world may be carrying the least familiar histories. In that sense, the galgo does more than tell its own story. It changes how we listen to every story written in blood, bone, and time.